Now, going to a less dark corner of the 1960s, let's talk a little bit about feminism. So, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, the definition of feminism, if you look it up in a dictionary, is the idea that men and women should have the same political, economic, and social rights. So, this does not mean that we want to replace the patriarchy or this system where men have the upper hand in society. We don't want to get rid of that and place women in charge instead. The idea is to achieve balance between the sexes and to have women have the same sorts of opportunities and the same level of respect and, say, pay economically as men. The feminist movement in the 1960s kicks off with the publication of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique. So Friedan had started writing her book in the 1950s, even though The Feminine Mystique was not published until 1963, as a response to this idea that women were expected to find fulfillment by being stay at home wives and mothers. And that if women didn't experience this pure bliss of a life of domesticity, if they were unhappy with it, that they were defective, that there was something wrong with them. And Friedan, in her book, The Feminine Mystique, says that not all women are cut out for this idea of domesticity, right? To expect women to all be happy being stay at home wives and mothers didn't regard that women had different education, different talents, and different personality, right? Or treating an entire gender as a monolith. And the other thing that Friedan talks about, in addition to this sense of discontent in the 1950s, is she focuses on the fact that the women's rights movement hasn't really gone anywhere since women achieved the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. She said, look, since 1920, we still don't have equal pay. We still don't have equal opportunities at work. We still have a very rigid understanding of gender roles and what women are supposed to do, and we still have a society that views women as subordinate to their husbands. So this is a problem, right? That we need to kind of fix these issues that hadn't really gone anywhere, and we lacked traction on due to the 1920s, the Great Depression, World War II, and then the conformity of the 1950s. So Betty Friedan will become the first president of the National Organization for Women, or NOW, founded in 1966. Now is made up of solidly middle class women, mostly white women, and really Now's initial goal is to ensure equality in the workforce. So really for Now, this was a priority not only because ensuring equal access to jobs and equal pay would help women across all social classes, but also for middle and upper class women, this sense of a job being a source of personal fulfillment rather than an economic need for them to work is also a compelling reason. So women do start to make gains in the workforce under the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission that's created during Johnson's time in office, the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which does make some attempts to rectify the disparity of pay between men and women doing the same jobs, so it doesn't fully fix it. And what's interesting is that as Now is focusing on jobs, a younger generation of activists is focusing instead on social gender roles for women. And we call this part of the feminist movement the women's liberation movement. So the women's liberation movement is very popular amongst young women and lower class women. They're perceived as kind of the more radical of the feminist movement in the 1960s. Many of these young women who identify with the women's liberation movement had been activists in other civil rights movements and were disgusted by the blatant sexism that they experienced and they witnessed. And so women's lib folks engaged in public protests against these gender norms in society, which they saw as restrictive. For example, at the 1968 Miss America pageant, women staged a public protest by putting items of oppression into a trash barrel. So they tossed things like a copy of Playboy magazine, high heels, and bras. But contrary to popular belief, they did not set bras on fire. So that's kind of a common misconception, right? That these women were so angry they were setting these bras on fire. I'm sorry to disappoint you. No woman setting bras on fire. They're very expensive, and some of us really need the support that they provide. So even if we wanted to torch them, they're kind of practical. Women's liberation focused not just on economic opportunities, but on personal freedom. And they defined that as freedom from these sort of social gender norms and expectations for women and bodily freedom. So, women's liberation is going to support the move to legalize abortion by arguing that women should be allowed to dictate when they become mothers. And if birth control is not as accessible, then we do need to legalize abortion, although they're also pushing for expanding access to birth control. And they said this is where women will finally achieve freedom, right? If they can choose if and when they become mothers. We see other rights movements in the 1960s. Note that I could do an entire podcast on all of these different movements, but because this is a survey class and podcast, we're just kind of giving you a little sampler of the 1960s. The LGBTQ movement is going to move forward and become much more public at the end of the 1960s. The 1960s is not the start of LGBTQ activism. We can trace public activism of LGBTQ folks back to the Mattachine Society, founded in 1951 by Harry Hay. And the Mattachine Society was really focused on breaking down social misconceptions about gay and lesbian people. Remember, in the 50s and 60s, being attracted to somebody of the same sex or being transgender was still classified as a mental illness. So, for the Mattachine Society, they're trying to challenge this notion that their attraction to people of the same sex is a sign of mental illness, or in religious traditions is seen as sinful. They're just like, we're just people, right? We just happen to love different people than you do. But really, the LGBTQ movement isn't going to gain a lot of momentum and public prominence until Stonewall. In 1969, an attempted police raid on a gay bar, the Stonewall Inn in New York, launches a 5-day long riot. And this Stonewall riot is led not only by gay and lesbian folks, but also by a lot of prominent transgender folks who unfortunately typically get erased from popular media treatment of Stonewall. For example, if you look at the most recent film version of Stonewall Hollywood treatment, they largely erase the contributions of transgender activists at the Stonewall Inn. But the Stonewall protests really start to become the new focus of the movement in striking down laws that targeted LGBTQ people. So, trying to remove same sex attraction as a mental illness, for example, trying to decriminalize same sex, or what the law broadly defines as sodomy, which is anything that's not penis and vagina intercourse. So this is the move, is to try to break down these legal barriers, these discriminatory laws that disproportionately targeted LGBTQ individuals, and that becomes the focus of the movement for a long period of time. Is breaking down the criminalization of same-sex sex. Among Latinos, we see activism grow out of labor movements, particularly the United Farm Workers Union, formed initially to help mobilize agricultural communities and get these agricultural workers better working conditions and better pay. But increasingly, the leader of the UFW, Cesar Chavez, himself the son of farm workers, realized that a lot of the concerns and conditions facing these Latino farm workers were also concerns and conditions facing Latinos at large. And so the United Farm Workers Union does start to spin off and become part of this broader Latino rights movement. Chavez is inspired very deeply by Martin Luther King Jr. He also embraces a strategy of nonviolent protest. Like we see with the Black Power movement, this pride in Blackness and cultural heritage, we're going to see this similar pride in a Chicano identity and pride in La Raza coming out of Latino activism of the 1960s. Along a similar line, we have a Red Power movement, or a movement amongst Native Americans to try to, again, claim pride in their cultural heritage and to redress what they saw as longstanding wrongs. During the Truman and Eisenhower administration, There had been moves to dismantle the reservation system that had been in existence since the mid 1800s during westward expansion. But during Kennedy's administration, they suspended this attempt to break down reservations. And instead, Kennedy started the trend of recognizing the sovereignty of these different Native American tribes, recognizing their status as sovereign nations. We see movements like the Indian Youth Council and the American Indian Movement, or AIM, set up, and they use the language of anti-colonial movements, and they argue for more autonomy on their reservation lands. They demand the right to self-determine as independent nations, right, located within the United States. They also start to launch legal cases to try to either win back ancestral lands or to win back money and damages for occupation and seizure prior of these ancestral lands. For example, they launch a public occupation of Alcatraz between 1969 and 1971, and this sparks the process of embracing protests and litigation to both give Native Americans more autonomy and control over their homelands and their culture, and also to try to address these past abuses against Native Americans.